The toast was a violation. Lady Honora Ingram raised her glass, the crystal catching the meager candlelight, and smiled a smile that never touched her eyes. "To dear Lavinia's future," she said, her voice like honey laced with frost. "May she find a match worthy of her beauty and her station." Across the small, chilly dining room, Lavinia preened, a pale and pretty flower soaking up the attention. Prudence, seated at the far end of the table, did not raise her glass. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers tracing the worn seam of her gray wool dress. She was not included in the toast. She was rarely included in anything. She was furniture, a necessary but unnoticed fixture in the house, the quiet engine that kept its shabby gentility running. Earlier that day, a visitor, a portly local squire, had been taking tea in the parlor. From her small study off the hall, where she was meticulously balancing the household accounts, Prudence had heard every word. "And your other daughter?" the squire had asked, his voice booming. Lady Honora had laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was pure performance. "Oh, you mean Prudence? Dear girl, so devoted. But alas, no head for figures, no grasp of practical matters at all. She is a creature of sentiment, I'm afraid, entirely dependent on my guidance." Prudence had looked down at the ledger in front of her. The column of figures, neat and precise, told the story of their solvency, a solvency she purchased every week by stretching shillings into pounds, by haggling with the butcher in a low voice so no one would overhear, by mending Lavinia's lace instead of buying new. She thought of the 37 pounds, 6 shillings and 4 pence that stood between them and ruin. She thought of the lie. And she thought of the small, carved wooden kestrel her father had pressed into her hand the day before he died, his voice a rasping whisper. "Be strong, Prue. Your worth is not in their seeing." She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She simply dipped her pen in the ink, noted down the baker's bill, and made their world solvent for another day. Now, at dinner, the lie hung in the air between her and her stepmother. Penniless Prudence. Impractical Prudence. The girl with no head for figures. Honora's narrative had been repeated so often, in so many drawing rooms in the town of Marley, that it had become truth. Prudence was the drab backdrop against which the lovely Lavinia was meant to shine. Her work was invisible, her intelligence an inconvenience, her very presence a quiet reproach that her stepmother could not abide. Lavinia, oblivious, chattered on about a new bonnet. "Mama, do you think Mr. Garrick will notice the blue ribbons? He has such an eye for fashion." Honora smiled. "He will notice you, my dear. That is all that matters." Mr. Fletcher Garrick was the son of a solicitor, a man whose ambition far outstripped his means. But he was handsome and polished, and Honora had marked him as a potential stepping stone for Lavinia. Prudence knew, because she had seen the accounts, that Mr. Garrick was a man of significant debts and questionable character. But that, too, was a truth her stepmother preferred to ignore. The evening wore on, a tapestry of small slights and calculated omissions. When the tea was served, Prudence's cup was chipped. When the conversation turned to the upcoming assembly, it was assumed she would not attend. She was needed to press Lavinia's gown, to ensure Honora's shawl was perfectly aired. Her existence was one of service, unpaid and unacknowledged. She endured it with a quiet, unbreachable composure that her stepmother mistook for dullness. It was not dullness. It was a shield, forged in grief and hammered into shape by years of quiet diminishment. She was waiting. For what, she did not know. But she knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that this was not the end of her story. After dinner, she cleared the plates, her movements efficient and silent. In the kitchen, she found the cook, Ada, grumbling over a smoking hearth. "That woman," Ada muttered, not needing to say who, "drinks a toast to one daughter, while the other holds the house up on her own shoulders." Prudence offered the older woman a small, rare smile. "The shoulders are strong, Ada." She picked up her father's wooden kestrel from the mantelpiece where she kept it while she worked. Its smooth, worn surface was a comfort. She was 24 years old, and for the last 6 years, since her father's death, she had been a ghost in her own home. They called her penniless. They called her simple. They called her a creature of sentiment. But in the quiet of her small, cold room, with the ledger book stored neatly under her bed, Prudence Ingram knew exactly what she was worth. The Marley assembly rooms were a cacophony of strained laughter, shrill gossip, and the squeak of dancing slippers on a newly waxed floor. Prudence stood near the wall, a gray moth among butterflies. Lady Honora had, at the last moment, declared it was improper for Lavinia to attend without a chaperone, and that Prudence must come. The true reason, Prudence knew, was that Lavinia's favorite gloves had suffered a tear, and only Prudence had the skill to mend them so invisibly. Now, her duty done, she was expected to make herself scarce. She watched her stepsister twirl in the arms of Fletcher Garrick, his smile a little too bright, his hand holding Lavinia's a little too tightly. Her stepmother was holding court with a clutch of town gossips, her expression one of maternal triumph. No one spoke to Prudence. No one looked at her. It was as she expected. She was observing the crowd when she first saw him. Ambrose Sinclair, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, stood alone near the great hearth, a pillar of granite in a room of chattering birds. He was a man made of shadows and silence, his face harsh, his reputation preceding him. They said he was a recluse, that he had locked himself away in his vast, decaying estate since his return from the continent 2 years prior, a man hollowed out by war or grief, or perhaps both. His attendance tonight was a shock to the entire county. He looked bored, weary, and utterly unapproachable. His gaze swept the room with a cold disinterest that dismissed everyone and everything. Then, the small moment of conflict. Mr. Garrick, having deposited a flushed Lavinia back with her mother, approached a group of men near where Prudence stood. Flushed with punch and self-importance, he sought to impress them. He noticed Prudence, a convenient target for his wit. "Ah, Miss Ingram," he said, his voice carrying. "Contemplating the vast emptiness of the dance floor. It must remind you of your family coffers." A few of the men snickered. Prudence felt a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach, but her face remained impassive. She inclined her head slightly but did not speak. Garrick, emboldened, continued. He launched into an anecdote about a recent dispute over the old common land bordering the Duke's estate. "And old Farmer Giles insists the boundary stone was moved in his grandfather's day." A preposterous claim. The parish records are clear as mud, of course. No one can make sense of them. He gestured vaguely. "It's a matter of local hearsay." Prudence's voice, when it came, was low but clear, cutting through the men's murmuring. The parish record of 1788, Clause 7, states the boundary is marked by the great oak struck by lightning. The tree fell in the storm of 1803. The record of tithe payments from the following year notes that Giles's grandfather was granted use of the 3 acres south of the fallen oak in exchange for clearing the timber. The boundary was never formally redrawn. The claim is not preposterous. It is merely old. There was a sudden, sharp silence. The men stared at her.
Fletcher Garrick's face mottled with fury and embarrassment.
He had been corrected, publicly, by the penniless Ingram girl. "What would you know of it?" he sneered. "I transcribed the parish accounts for Lady Honora last month," Prudence said simply. "I have a good memory for detail." It was then she felt a new quality to the silence. A weight. She looked up and found the Duke of Kestrel Chase was no longer looking at the room. He was looking directly at her. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, and they held no warmth, but they held an unnerving focus. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was appraisal. He took 2 steps forward. The group of men, including Garrick, seemed to shrink. The Duke's voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. He did not look at Prudence. He looked at Fletcher Garrick. "Is your memory as poor as your manners, Mr. Garrick?" Garrick paled, stammering an incoherent reply. The Duke did not wait for it. He held Prudence's gaze for 1 second longer, a silent, unreadable acknowledgement, then turned and walked from the room without another word. The assembly felt suddenly airless. Lady Honora was hurrying toward them, her face a mask of fury. But Prudence barely noticed. For the first time in 6 years, someone had looked past the gray dress and the quiet demeanor. Someone had seen her competence, not her poverty. And it was the one man in the room whom no one dared to challenge. The granite pillar had moved, and in doing so, had changed the shape of her world. 2 days later, the Duke of Kestrel Chase's black carriage, stark and severe as the man himself, drew up outside the Ingrams' modest house on Church Street. The arrival caused a sensation. Curtains twitched all the way down the lane. Lady Honora, alerted by a frantic Lavinia, flew into a state of barely controlled panic. She smoothed her hair, pinched her cheeks for color, and shoved Lavinia forward. "He has come for you, my love. Be charming. Be beautiful. Our fortunes are made." Prudence was in her study, mending a tear in a household account book with a strip of fine paper and paste, when the knock came. It was not the light rap of a social caller, but a solid, authoritative sound. She heard Ada shuffle to the door, then a low, masculine voice she recognized at once. Honora's fluting tones followed, a cascade of welcome and flattery. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor! Do come in. Come into our humble home. Lavinia, my dear, come and greet the Duke." Prudence remained where she was, her hands steady on her work. She had no part in this. This was for Lavinia. She could hear the drawing-room murmurings, her stepmother's cloying sweetness, Lavinia's nervous giggles, and a deep, resonant silence that could only be the Duke. Then, his voice, cutting through the pleasantries like a blade. "I am not here to see Miss Lavinia Ingram. I am here for Miss Prudence Ingram." A stunned silence fell over the house. Prudence froze, her mending forgotten. She heard her own name, spoken with stark clarity. A moment later, Lady Honora was at her study door, her face a thunderous mask of disbelief and rage. "The Duke is asking for you," she hissed, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" Prudence had done nothing. She rose, smoothed her plain dress, and walked into the drawing room. Ambrose Sinclair stood by the fireplace, dwarfing the room. He looked just as he had at the assembly, grim, imposing, and utterly indifferent to the social storm he had just created. He ignored Honora and Lavinia, his pale eyes fixed on Prudence. He did not waste time on greetings. "Miss Ingram, you have a good memory for detail." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I do, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even. "The archives at Kestrel Chase are in a state of chaos," he continued, his tone clipped and impersonal. "My solicitor has fallen ill. I require someone to sort, catalog, and index the estate papers, ledgers, and deeds.
The work is precise and requires absolute discretion. Your display at the assembly suggests you possess the necessary skills." Lavinia stared, mouth agape. Honora looked as though she might faint from sheer fury.
"My Prudence?" she stammered. "But she has no experience in such grand matters. She is a simple girl."
The Duke's gaze did not waver from Prudence. "I am not looking for a grand lady. I am looking for a competent mind. I will pay £20 per month for a period of 3 months. You will reside at the Chase. The work begins Monday. £20 a month was a fortune. It was more than Prudence managed for the entire household in half a year. It was freedom. It was an escape. It was also, she saw from the avaricious glint in her stepmother's eye, money that Honora already considered her own.
That is most generous, Your Grace,
Honora said, recovering herself.
Of course, as her guardian, any financial arrangements must be made through me.
The Duke's gaze flickered to Honora for the first time, a look of such profound contempt that she physically recoiled. I am hiring Miss Ingram, Lady Honora. I will pay Miss Ingram. He turned back to Prudence. The air was thick with unspoken things. This was not a social invitation. It was a business proposition. A reluctant alliance born of his need and her observed ability. Do you accept the position, Miss Ingram? He asked. She looked at her stepmother's face, contorted with greed and resentment. She looked at Lavinia's confused pout. Then she looked at the cold, unreadable man who was offering her a way out, however temporary. He was offering her a wage for the very thing she was punished and belittled for at home, her intelligence.
Yes, Your Grace,
Prudence said, her voice clear and steady.
I accept.
He gave a single, sharp nod. My carriage will collect you on Monday at 9. And with that, he turned and was gone, leaving a whirlwind of shock and fury in his wake. As the front door closed, Lady Honora rounded on her.
You planned this. You schemed to supplant your own sister.
Prudence met her stepmother's tirade with the same quiet composure she met everything.
I did nothing but answer a question truthfully, she said.
But inside, a small, fragile seed of hope had taken root. For 3 months, she would not be the penniless Ingram. She would be an archivist. She would be paid for her work. She would be seen. Kestrel Chase rose from the rolling mist of the countryside like a stone fortress. It was a place of severe, magnificent beauty, but it felt as if it were holding its breath. The long drive was overgrown, the gardens were a tangle of weeds, and many of the great windows were shuttered. It was a house in mourning, a perfect reflection of its master. As Prudence stepped down from the carriage, a woman with a stern face and iron-gray hair met her at the door.
Miss Ingram, I am Mrs. Draycott, the housekeeper. His Grace is in his study. He does not wish to be disturbed. I will show you to your rooms and then to the library.
The welcome was as cold as the marble floor of the great hall. The house was silent, vast, and layered with the chill of disuse. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting from a high window. Her footsteps echoed. Mrs. Draycott led her up a grand, sweeping staircase and down a long gallery where the portraits of Sinclair ancestors watched her with faded, disapproving eyes. The rooms assigned to her were comfortable but Spartan. They overlooked a neglected rose garden where briars were choking the last remaining blooms.
The library is in the west wing,
the housekeeper said, her tone leaving no room for questions.
His Grace expects you to begin immediately. Dinner is at 7. You will take it in your room.
Prudence was being quarantined, kept separate from the master of the house. The transactional nature of their arrangement could not have been clearer. The library, however, was a revelation.
It was 2 stories high, lined from floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines crumbling, their gold leaf dulled with grime. In the center of the room, tables overflowed with stacks of papers, ledgers, and rolled vellum deeds tied with faded ribbon. It was a mountain of chaos, a lifetime of history left to rot. To anyone else,
it would have been a daunting, impossible task. To Prudence, it was a sanctuary. Here was a problem she could solve. Here was a world she could bring into order. She took off her bonnet, rolled up her sleeves, and began. For the first week, she saw no one but a young maid who brought her a tray for luncheon, and Mrs. Draycott, who appeared at the door each evening to inform her that her dinner was ready upstairs. She did not see the Duke at all. But she felt his presence everywhere, in the profound silence of the house, in the melancholic grandeur of her surroundings. She worked with a methodical patience that was second nature to her. She separated deeds from correspondence, household accounts from personal journals. She dusted each volume, her hands gentle, her focus absolute. She discovered first editions of great poets, forgotten maps of the estate, and the careful, spidery handwriting of generations of duchesses in their household books. She was not just sorting paper, she was piecing together the soul of a family. One afternoon, while searching for a better source of light, she opened a door at the far end of the library and stepped into a vast, glass-paned conservatory. It was a ruin. The glass was clouded with grime, the ironwork rusted, and the stone floor littered with dead leaves and shattered pots. But in the center, fighting for life amidst the decay, was a single camellia bush, its waxy leaves thick with dust but stubbornly green. On one of its branches was a single, perfect, white bud. An overwhelming urge to save it, to nurture this one spot of life in the desolate house, took hold of her. The next day, she spent her lunch hour not eating, but clearing the debris from around the camellia. She found a watering can and brought it water. She wiped the dust from its leaves, one by one. It was not in her contract. It was an act of quiet rebellion against the gloom. A week later, the Duke appeared. He entered the library so silently she didn't notice him until he was standing by one of the tables, looking at the neat stacks of paper she had begun to create, each labeled in her clear, precise hand. He did not speak for a long time. "You have made progress," he said finally. His voice was as clipped as ever. "I have begun the initial sorting," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I have found the original charters for the Marley holdings, dating back to 1650. He picked up a ledger she had cleaned and repaired. "Mrs. Draycott tells me you have been working in the conservatory." Her hands stilled. She had been discovered. "The camellia was alive," she said simply. "It seemed a shame to let it die." He looked at her then, his pale eyes searching her face. "No one has set foot in there for 5 years." He did not say more, but that night, for the first time, a fire was lit in the great library hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the books. And when she came down the next morning, she found a tray with tea and biscuits waiting for her on a small table. A few days after that, the camellia bloomed. Prudence snipped the single white flower and placed it in a chipped water glass on her work table. That evening, the Duke did not retreat to his study. He brought a book and sat in a chair by the fire, reading in silence. They did not speak, but the vast, cold room felt a little smaller, a little warmer. He was not just her employer anymore. He was a quiet presence in the room, a silent witness to the order she was creating, both on the page and in the air itself. The visit was Lady Honora's idea, a frontal assault disguised as a social call. She arrived in a hired chaise with Lavinia in tow, determined to inspect her stepdaughter's situation and, more importantly, to parade Lavinia's charms before the Duke. They swept into the great hall of Kestrel Chase like a gust of cloying perfume, their bright silks and fluttering ribbons a jarring contrast to the house's somber dignity.
"Prudence, my dear,"
Lady Honora exclaimed, her voice echoing in the stone chamber.
"We simply had to come and see how you were faring. We have been so worried about you, all alone in this great, draughty place."
Prudence, summoned from the library by Mrs. Draycott, met them at the foot of the stairs. She wore a plain, dark dress, practical for her work, and there was a faint smudge of archival dust on her cheek. She looked, to her stepmother's eye, like a servant.
"I am faring very well, thank you, Lady Honora,"
Prudence said calmly. Lavinia looked around with wide, unimpressed eyes.
"It's so empty," she whispered, "and cold."
When the Duke emerged from his study, Honora immediately shifted her focus, her smile becoming dazzling.
"Your Grace, how good of you to receive us. I felt it my duty to check on my poor, sheltered Prudence. She is so unaccustomed to the world."
Ambrose Sinclair's gaze was glacial. He gave a stiff, formal bow. "Miss Ingram is a valued employee. She is neither poor nor sheltered. She is competent." The word, spoken in his flat, authoritative tone, hung in the air. It was a shield for Prudence, and a direct contradiction of Honora's narrative. The visit was a disaster. The Duke was polite but remote, answering their attempts at conversation with monosyllables. He refused to give them a tour of the house and made it clear their visit was an interruption. They left within the hour, Lady Honora's face tight with fury. The repercussions began almost immediately. Back in Marley, a new story started to circulate, whispered over teacups and card tables. It was a sly, poisonous tale spun by Fletcher Garrick, who had become Honora's willing co-conspirator. The story suggested that Prudence Ingram hadn't secured her position through competence, but through a more cunning, feminine art. They said she was preying on the grieving, reclusive Duke, worming her way into his confidence, taking advantage of his isolation. The smudge of dust on her cheek became a sign of impropriety, her quiet confidence a mark of sly ambition. The narrative shifted from penniless Prudence to conniving Prudence. Lady Honora, far from defending her stepdaughter, fanned the flames.
"I fear the position is too much for her,"
she would say with a sigh, her eyes full of false concern.
"She has always had such fanciful notions. I worry she is giving His Grace the wrong impression."
The slander was designed to ruin Prudence's reputation and, by extension, force the Duke to dismiss her. If he kept her on, it would be seen as confirmation of the illicit rumors. The attack escalated from gossip to something more tangible. Garrick, leveraging his minor legal knowledge, saw an opportunity to secure his position with Honora and destroy Prudence in one stroke. He and Honora conspired. They knew that Prudence's father had a distinctive, slightly shaky handwriting in his final years. Garrick was a skilled mimic. Together, they drafted a letter. It purported to be from the late Mr. Ingram to his wife Honora, written shortly before his death. In it, the writer lamented his daughter Prudence's unstable mind and tendency toward delusion. It spoke of her being unfit for responsibility and entrusted her wholly to Honora's care, granting Honora absolute legal authority over any income or property Prudence might ever acquire. It was a cage forged of ink and paper, designed to strip Prudence of all agency, to legally render her the dependent child Honora always claimed she was. It was a masterpiece of loving, concerned cruelty. Armed with this document, Fletcher Garrick requested a private meeting with the Duke of Kestrel Chase, presenting himself as a concerned neighbor, there to save a great man from a terrible deception. The summons came in the late afternoon. A footman, his face carefully blank, informed Prudence that His Grace required her presence in his study.
The study was the heart of the Duke's solitude, a room she had never entered. It was paneled in dark wood, smelling of leather and old grievances. Ambrose Sinclair was not seated behind his great desk. He stood by the window, a black silhouette against the failing light. The room was cold, the fire unlit. He did not turn when she entered. "Mr. Fletcher Garrick paid me a visit this morning," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual clipped authority. It sounded tired. He turned, and in his hand he held a single sheet of paper. "He brought this. He felt it was his duty to inform me of the true nature of my archivist." He held the letter out to her. Prudence took it. The paper was aged, the ink faded in places. The handwriting was a shockingly good imitation of her father's. She read the words, each one a small, poisoned dart. Unstable mind, tendency toward delusion, my solemn duty to protect her from herself. It was her stepmother's voice, her stepmother's narrative, channeled through her dead father's hand. A wave of ice and fire washed through her. The ultimate betrayal. To have her father's memory twisted into a weapon against her. She looked up from the page. The Duke was watching her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. This was the true test. He had seen her competence, but did he see her character? Did he believe the whispers? Did he believe the lie on this page? For a moment, his silence felt like an accusation, the weight of the county's opinion pressing down on her. She thought of crying. She thought of shouting. She did neither. She folded the letter with precise, steady hands and met his gaze. "My father never wrote these words," she said, her voice low but perfectly clear. "He would never have written them." She did not offer excuses or frantic denials. She stated a simple, fundamental truth. The Duke's expression did not change. He was observing her, weighing her. The silence continued for 3 more heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. "Can you prove it?" he asked. His voice was quiet, a simple request for facts. It was the question she had expected from him. He was a man who dealt in evidence, not emotion. She thought for a moment, her mind, so used to finding patterns in chaos, searching for a flaw in the forgery. "The paper is convincing," she admitted, "and the hand is a clever imitation. But he always looped the tail of his capital I under the letter. This one loops over." It was a tiny detail, something only she would know. But that is a small thing. The truest proof is not on the page. It is in the memory of the man he was. He believed my mind was my finest asset. He would never have called it unstable. Her defense was her own testimony, her own character against the slanders of others. She stood before him, with no fortune and no allies, armed only with the truth and her own self-possession. She had given him her answer. Now it was his turn. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in the depths of his pale eyes. It was not doubt. It was a decision being made. He nodded slowly, a single, decisive movement. "Then we shall find the evidence to support your memory." Trust had been tested, and with a few plain words, it had held. Ambrose Sinclair watched her leave the study, her back straight, her head held high. He did not call her back. He remained by the window, the forged letter resting on his desk. He had known, from the moment Garrick had handed it to him, that it was a forgery. He had spent years on the continent dealing with spies and informants, with documents both genuine and counterfeit.
He could smell the lie in the ink, see the slight hesitation in the forged strokes that tried too hard to be natural. The paper was artificially aged with tea, a common, clumsy trick. Fletcher Garrick was an amateur. But the Duke had not revealed this. He had let Garrick play out his sordid little drama, listening with cold patience to the man's honeyed, venomous warnings about the scheming Miss Ingram. He did it for one reason. He needed to see what Prudence would do. He had seen her competence in the assembly rooms, her quiet diligence in his library. He had found himself soothed by her calm presence, by the way she had brought a quiet, breathing life back into the dead spaces of his home. The single camellia in the water glass on her desk felt more vital than any of the grand, dusty bouquets that had once filled the house. But he did not yet know the core of her. He had lived in a world of betrayal. His late wife's deceptions had been subtle, smiling, and had nearly destroyed him. He had come to Kestrel Chase to seal himself off from a world he no longer trusted. Prudence Ingram, with her steady hands and her honest eyes, was the first person in years who had made him reconsider the bars of his cage. He needed to know if her composure was a shield for integrity or a mask for cunning. When he had shown her the letter, he had watched for the flicker of panic, the rush of theatrical tears, the wild, baseless accusations of a guilty woman caught in a lie. He had seen none of it. He had seen a flash of profound hurt, quickly mastered. He had seen the quiet steel of her resolve. And her answer. The truest proof is not on the page. It is in the memory of the man he was. Had struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the plain, unvarnished truth. It was the defense of a person who knew her own worth, even when the world conspired to deny it. He had his answer. Prudence Ingram was genuine, and the cold, quiet anger that began to build in him was something he had not felt in a very long time. It was the anger of a protector. Fletcher Garrick and Lady Honora Ingram had not merely slandered an employee. They had attacked a woman under his roof. They had trespassed. And Ambrose Sinclair always dealt with trespassers. End point of view shift. The invitations went out the next day. The Duke of Kestrel Chase was hosting a small dinner for his neighbors. The news flew through Marley, causing a fever of speculation. The reclusive Duke, entertaining? It was unprecedented. Lady Honora and Lavinia received their invitation with triumph. Clearly, the Duke had dismissed the girl, and this was his way of making amends, of turning his attention to the correct Ingram sister. Fletcher Garrick accepted with a smug sense of satisfaction. His plan had worked. He would be honored at the Duke's table, his status as a trusted friend of the gentry cemented. Also on the guest list was Lady Theodosia Fenwick, a sharp-tongued old dowager with a mind like a steel trap and no patience for fools. She missed nothing and feared no one. When Prudence saw the guest list, she felt a knot of apprehension. "What are you planning?" she asked the Duke that evening in the library. "A dinner," he replied, not looking up from the book he was reading. "Plainly," she said, repeating the word that had become a small touchstone between them. He finally looked at her, and for the first time she saw the ghost of a smile in his eyes. "Plainly," he confirmed. The night of the dinner, Kestrel Chase was transformed. The chandeliers were lit, the silver was polished, and fires blazed in every hearth. It was the first time the house had looked truly alive since her arrival. Prudence was instructed to attend, not as an archivist, but as a guest. Mrs. Draycott, her gruffness softened by a grudging respect, had laid out a simple but elegant dark blue silk gown for her, one of the late Duchess's, altered to fit. When she entered the drawing room, a hush fell. Lady Honora's jaw dropped. Fletcher Garrick stared, his smugness faltering. Prudence looked regal, composed, her quiet dignity amplified by the fine silk. She was not the drab servant they had tried to make her. She was a lady in the house of a duke. Dinner was a tense affair. The duke was a reserved but impeccable host. He guided the conversation, his quiet authority keeping the nervous chatter from collapsing. Lady Honora tried repeatedly to draw him out, to position Lavinia in his sights, but he deflected her efforts with polite, immovable calm. Fletcher Garrick attempted to pontificate on matters of law and land, but Lady Theodosia Fenwick cut him down with a few surgically precise questions that exposed the shallowness of his knowledge. After the meal, the ladies retired, but the Duke requested the gentlemen remain, and, with a pointed look at Lady Theodosia, added, "And you, Lady Fenwick, I would value your counsel. Miss Ingram, you will also stay." The trap was about to be sprung. When they were all settled in the drawing-room once more, the Duke began. "I convened this dinner to discuss a matter of some delicacy," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "It concerns the character of my archivist, Miss Ingram." Lady Honora leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Garrick adopted a somber, concerned expression. "As some of you know," the Duke continued, "concerns were brought to my attention regarding Miss Ingram's suitability for her post. I was presented with evidence." He produced the forged letter and laid it on the table. "This letter, purportedly from the late Mr. Ingram, suggests his daughter is unstable and not to be trusted." Honora put a hand to her heart. "A terrible private sorrow, Your Grace. I have tried my best to protect the dear girl." "Indeed," the Duke said, his voice dangerously soft. "Such a convincing document, except for a few small details." He then introduced a man who had been waiting quietly by the door. "This is Mr. Abbott from London. He is an expert in paper, ink, and historical documents. Mr. Abbott, your findings?" Mr. Abbott stepped forward. In a dry, academic voice, he systematically dismantled the letter. The paper was from a batch made 2 years ago, not 7. The ink contained a chemical binder not in use until last year. The forgery, he concluded, was competent, but undeniably recent. A gasp went through the room. Fletcher Garrick had gone white as a sheet. Lady Honora began to stammer, but the Duke held up a hand. "That, however, is not the most compelling piece of evidence." He turned to Prudence. "Miss Ingram, during your cataloging of my family's archives, did you find anything pertaining to your own family's property?" Prudence's heart was hammering, but her voice was steady. She had found it 2 days ago, tucked away in a dusty deed box labeled Marley Out Parcels, a document that had changed everything. "I did, Your Grace," she said. She walked to a side table and picked up a heavy sheet of vellum. "This is the original deed for my father's house on Church Street. It was once part of a larger parcel of land owned by your family, which is why the deed was stored here at the Chase." She unrolled it. "When my father died, he did not leave the house to Lady Honora, as she has always claimed. He left it in trust for her use during her lifetime, with the property and full title to pass directly and solely to me upon my 25th birthday." She paused, letting the words sink in. "My 25th birthday is next Tuesday." Lady Honora made a strangled sound. "But there's more," Prudence continued, her voice gaining strength. "The deed makes reference to a separate financial instrument." "My father, knowing his health was failing, established a private annuity for me, to be managed by the Sinclair family's bank in London. He wanted to ensure my independence. The annuity was to begin payment on my 25th birthday. She looked directly at her stepmother. I was never penniless. My father provided for me. You simply concealed it. The room was utterly silent. The exposure was total, devastating. Lady Theodosia Fenwick looked from the ashen face of Honora Ingram to the pale, sweating face of Fletcher Garrick. "So," the dowager said, her voice dripping with acid, "you forged a letter to defraud a young woman of her wages, while simultaneously concealing her true inheritance? That is not merely slander. That is conspiracy and fraud." The Duke's gaze settled on Garrick. "Forgery," he said, his voice a low, chilling promise, "is a transportable offence, Mr. Garrick. I believe the magistrates will be very interested in Mr. Abbott's testimony." He then turned his eyes, cold as a winter sea, on Lady Honora. "And fraud, madam, is a matter for the courts. You are no longer welcome in this house, or, I should think, in this county." Honora gave a choked sob and collapsed into her chair. Lavinia, who had watched the entire scene with growing horror, rushed to her mother's side, not with sympathy, but with the dawning, sickening realization of the depth of her mother's deception. Fletcher Garrick, utterly ruined, simply sat, staring into the abyss that had just opened at his feet. In the centre of it all, Prudence stood tall, the deed in her hand, her name clear and bold upon it. She was no longer a ghost. She was the master of her own house. In the quiet aftermath, the house felt cleansed. The disgraced guests had departed, leaving behind only the scent of beeswax and the comfortable silence of the library. Prudence stood before the fire, the vellum deed spread on the table before her. Prudence Ingram, proprietor. The words seemed to shimmer in the firelight. For 6 years her name had meant nothing. It had been an appendage, a convenience. Now it was a declaration of ownership, of self. She traced the letters with her finger, feeling the weight of her father's love and foresight. A final gift that had been waiting for her all this time. Ambrose came to stand beside her. The harsh lines of his face seemed to have softened in the warm light. He did not offer condolences for her past suffering, or congratulations on her newfound fortune. He offered something far more valuable. "They tried to make you invisible," he said, his voice a low murmur beside her. "But I saw you from the first." He was right. He had seen the archivist at the assembly, the gardener in the conservatory, the quiet woman of integrity in his study. He had seen past the grey dress and the whispers, and had recognized the truth of her. He moved to stand before her, and the space between them crackled with unspoken emotion. Then, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, the man of stone and silence, went down on one knee. It was not a grand theatrical gesture. It was a solid, grounding movement, an act of profound and deliberate respect. He took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Your name is on the deed to your house," he said, his pale grey eyes holding hers. "I am asking you to put it on the deed to this one, not as an archivist, as its duchess, as my wife." He paused, and the corner of his mouth tilted in that rare ghost of a smile she had come to know. "Plainly." The word hung in the air between them, their private language.
It meant honesty. It meant clarity. It meant a love built not on poetry or passion, but on a foundation of mutual recognition and deep, quiet respect. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. He was seeing her worth and asking to stand beside it. Tears, which she had refused to shed in years of sorrow and neglect, pricked at the back of her eyes. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of homecoming.
She looked down at this grim, guarded man who had opened his house and then his trust to her. She saw the man who had defended her honor, who valued her mind, and who had, in his own quiet way, brought her back to life. "Plainly," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The word was an answer, an acceptance, an echo of his own heart. "Yes." He rose, and drawing her close, he tilted her chin up. His kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep and certain promise. It was a seal on a contract of the heart, signed in the warm light of the library, a promise of a shared future built together. 1 year later, the conservatory at Kestrel Chase was a riot of color and life. Sunlight streamed through sparkling clean glass panes, illuminating the vibrant blossoms of orchids, the deep green of ferns, and the proud white blooms of a dozen healthy camellia bushes. Prudence, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, stood in the center of it all, a watering can in her hand, a smudge of good, honest earth on her cheek. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of a staff that respected its new mistress, the murmur of conversation, and the occasional startling sound of the Duke's low laughter. She had taken to the management of the vast estate with the same quiet competence she had once applied to her stepmother's meager accounts. She had restored the gardens, reopened the shuttered rooms, and filled the house with light and air. She had brought it back to life, just as she had the single dying camellia. Ambrose found her there, as he often did. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, simply breathing in the warm, fragrant air. "The ledges for the North Farm are balanced," she said, leaning back against him. "We will show a profit this year." "I had no doubt," he murmured into her hair. He pressed a small object into her hand. She opened her palm and saw a perfect, exquisitely carved wooden kestrel, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was crafted from a pale, smooth wood, and its tiny eyes seemed to hold a spark of life. It was a perfect ducal counterpart to the humble, worn bird her father had given her, which still sat on the mantelpiece in their bedroom. "For the woman who brought the heart back to Kestrel Chase," he said. She turned in his arms, her eyes shining. The past year had seen many changes. Lady Honora, stripped of her home and her reputation, now lived in reduced circumstances in a boarding house in Bath, her deceptions having earned her nothing but obscurity. Lavinia, chastened and humbled, had surprised everyone. Freed from her mother's ambitions, she had married a quiet country clergyman and found a modest, genuine happiness she never would have known otherwise. She and Prudence exchanged letters, a tentative but growing bond of sisterhood forming between them. Fletcher Garrick, facing prosecution, had fled to the continent, his name a byword for disgrace in Marley. Prudence looked up at her husband, at the man who had looked at a woman the world called penniless, and seen a duchess in waiting. He was no longer a man made of shadows. The grief he carried was still a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He was a man who had chosen to live again, to love again. "Thank you,"
she whispered, clutching the small bird. They walked out into the gardens together, hand in hand, a true partnership. They stood on the great lawn, looking out over the rolling hills of the estate, their home. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the land. It was a world of order, of peace, of quiet, thriving life. A world they had built together. Plainly. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel.
Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.